A black entrepreneur was told to give up his first-class seat for a white passenger. Seconds later, one trade he made cost the flight attendant their job. They thought pushing him back to economy would humble him. They didn't realize the man they insulted could move markets with a single trade. Subscribe if you believe respect should never depend on a seat number. Sir, we've had a seat reassignment. You'll need to move to economy. The words struck like a stone through glass, sharp, sudden, and oddly delicate in delivery. Dorian Kells blinked, unsure he had heard correctly, the low hum of the boarding gate momentarily muting in his ears. He stood still, one hand gripping the handle of his sleek carry-on, the other hovering near his inside jacket pocket where his boarding pass had just been scanned. His posture, tall and composed, held a quiet strength that turned heads as he walked. But now he felt the eyes of the gate agents, the crew, and a few passing passengers shift toward him with silent interest. Across from him stood a man in a crisp airline uniform. Flight attendant Trevor Mace, mid-30s, square-jawed, with a sharp smile that didn't quite touch his eyes. He radiated forced cheer, the kind trained into flight crews over hundreds of shifts, yet something beneath it felt off, calculated, insincere. Dorian didn't move. "There must be a mistake," he said evenly, his voice calm but firm. "My seat is 1A. I booked it weeks ago." Trevor's smile tightened. "Yes, well, the manifest updated. You've been reassigned to economy. These things happen. I'm going to need you to step aside so we can continue boarding." From behind, Mason caught up, slightly breathless from weaving through the crowd. "Everything all right?" he asked, holding the silver briefcase containing Dorian's trade presentation, the one they had spent 3 months preparing. The case alone was guarded with biometric locks, yet now the man who built the algorithm behind it was being casually ushered out of first class like a misplaced coat. Dorian's eyes followed a white man in a pale blazer, no more than a few years older than him, who had just been waved through into the jet bridge. The man gave a polite nod to Trevor, who returned it with a familiarity that didn't exist for Dorian. Seconds later, that man disappeared down the corridor toward the seat Dorian had paid for. Mason lowered his voice. "Do you want me to speak to the gate manager?" But Dorian held up a hand, still facing Trevor. "On what grounds was my seat changed?" he asked, tone neutral. Trevor shrugged too quickly. "Maintenance issue, routing adjustment, random selection." He waved a dismissive hand, as though the very question was a nuisance. "You're still on the flight, sir. Please, let's not hold up the others." There was no anger in Dorian's expression, only a studied silence. His mind, conditioned through years of pattern recognition and data modeling, read the signs clearly. The sudden change, the convenient substitution, the lack of eye contact, the practiced response. He had once designed an algorithm that detected fraudulent freight reroutes across 10 countries using nothing but discrepancy intervals and phrasing cues. This wasn't randomness. This was choice. Still, he nodded slowly and stepped aside, not because he accepted the decision, but because he needed to understand it fully before acting. Behind him, Mason hesitated. "We can fix this later," Mason said quietly. "Let's just get on the plane." Dorian turned toward the gate, passing through the jet bridge without another word. But inside his head, thoughts had already begun aligning, like chess pieces on a silent board. It wasn't the downgrade that stung, it was the assumption behind it, that he would go quietly, that his presence in that seat was a favor, not a right, that value could be reassigned without consequence. The first thing he noticed upon stepping into the plane was the sterile chill of the recycled air. The second was the look Trevor gave him as he re-entered from the galley. It was the look of someone who believed they had won a minor battle, secured a small domain of control. Dorian moved down the aisle until he reached row 27. A middle seat, of course. He took it without protest, folding his tall frame carefully into the tight space between two men who barely glanced up. He straightened his blazer, exhaled, and leaned back. The low thrum of the engines hummed beneath his feet. Mason passed him 2 rows behind, mouthing, "I'm already on it," as he sat down and opened his laptop. There was no panic between them, no whispered outrage, just motion, quiet and precise. Around them, the cabin settled. A family with 2 kids fussed with overhead luggage. A businessman in an ill-fitting tie checked his phone for the 5th time in 2 minutes. And yet, despite the chatter and shuffle, there was an almost cinematic focus on Dorian from those who had seen the gate incident. They didn't speak, but they observed. Not out of sympathy, but curiosity, trying to place him, trying to understand why someone like him had ended up in a middle seat. He didn't fidget. He didn't sigh. He watched. The plane rolled back from the gate, engines rising in volume. Outside the small window beside the aisle passenger, sunlight caught on the silver wingtip, flaring for a moment before the aircraft turned. Dorian pulled out his phone. The boarding pass still displayed 1A. He looked at it once more, not with regret, but with precision, like marking the origin point in a chain reaction. A cascade always starts with a single imbalance. He opened his secure notes app and typed a single line. Sometimes, patience is not surrender. It's preparation. The seatbelt clicked shut around Dorian Kell's waist with a finality that rang louder than the overhead announcements. He sat stiffly in the middle of row 22, economy class, shoulders boxed in between 2 strangers, knees pressed against the tray table in front of him. His tailored navy suit creased slightly at the elbows as he adjusted his posture, but there was no position that offered dignity in that seat. The man to his left, wearing a hoodie and earbuds, glanced at him briefly before returning to his phone. The man to his right gave a nod, then looked away, puzzled. Something didn't add up. Dorian didn't belong here, and everyone could feel it. Trevor Mace, the flight attendant responsible for the reassignment, moved briskly down the aisle, tray in hand, eyes darting away as he passed Dorian's row. His earlier words still echoed like static. "Sir, we've had a seat reassignment. You'll need to move to economy." The smirk he'd tried to hide had not gone unnoticed. It was the kind of smile that knew exactly what it was doing and counted on the target's silence to make it stick. Dorian had said nothing then, not because he didn't want to, but because silence, at the right moment, speaks louder than protest. Behind him, Mason sat 2 rows back, his eyes glued to his laptop screen. The soft glow of data streams reflected off his glasses. To anyone watching, he looked like a regular business assistant, maybe catching up on a report. But his fingers weren't writing a report. They were navigating a private trade interface, encrypted, directly connected to Vigen Systems' global market servers. Dorian had given him the nod, a small, almost imperceptible tilt of the chin, before taking his middle seat. Dorian shifted slightly, feeling the cheap seatbelt tighten. He didn't dwell on the humiliation. He analyzed it. He understood that Trevor's decision wasn't a random mix-up. It was an assumption, one rooted in arrogance and power imbalance. But what Trevor didn't know, and couldn't know, was that Dorian was not just another passenger. He was the architect of one of the most sophisticated AI logistics systems in the world. He had built algorithms that could balance freight traffic across continents with the swipe of a finger. And now, he was being forced to breathe recycled air in a seat too small for his frame, because someone had decided he didn't look like he belonged up front. The engines roared to life beneath the cabin floor, a low vibration building through the fuselage as the aircraft prepared for takeoff. Dorian pulled out his phone, the screen lighting up with a soft blue glow. His thumbs hovered over the keyboard as the plane taxied onto the runway. He wasn't messaging friends. He wasn't checking the news. He was composing the opening move in a different kind of journey, one that didn't require a boarding pass. The recipient field remained blank for now, but the content of the message took form with calm precision. To the board of Vistral Aviation Holdings. If one man can be moved from his rightful seat, so can an entire market. He paused, letting the words settle in his mind. It wasn't just a statement. It was a signal, to himself, to the system, to the moment. The wheels left the ground with a deep, reverberating hum, and Dorian felt the lift, not of the aircraft but of control shifting slowly into his hands. Beside him, the man in the hoodie slept. To his right, the other man flipped through a magazine, oblivious. But Dorian's gaze was steady, locked on the tiny screen, where he typed a second line. "And I've built the tools to prove it." The tray in the aisle rattled. Overhead compartments thudded faintly as turbulence rocked the aircraft with a low, growling hum. Dorian Kells remained still in his economy seat, spine straight despite the sharp jolt that made several passengers grip their armrests. Ice cubes clinked inside plastic cups, and a few gasps echoed through the cabin. For a brief moment, the chaos outside the plane was mirrored within. Then, like a wave passing through a string, the motion settled, but not the tension. A shadow fell across Dorian's row. Trevor Mace's polished shoes came into view first, then his overly practiced smile. He leaned slightly toward Dorian, gripping the top of the headrest in front of him with one hand, the other clutching a small notepad. His tone was honeyed, but the venom underneath was unmistakable. "Would you like something to drink, sir?" he asked, loud enough for the nearby passengers to hear. "Perhaps you'd prefer what they're having up front." His lips curled just slightly after the final word, like he'd delivered a private joke. Dorian turned his head slowly, locking eyes with him, not from surprise but calculation. The surrounding passengers had picked up on the energy shift. A man across the aisle furrowed his brow. A teenager in the window seat stopped chewing his gum. Even the hum of the engine seemed to pause in anticipation. Dorian's voice, when it came, was low and composed. "No, thank you," he said evenly. "I'm already invested in something far more valuable." Trevor blinked. The reply hadn't landed the way he expected. He stood there, unsure whether to respond with another quip or move on. His grip on the notepad tightened slightly. Dorian leaned forward, his tone still calm but unmistakably direct. "Do you know what a cascade trade is, Mr. Mace?" Caught off guard, Trevor's posture stiffened. His eyes darted for a moment as if looking for a reason to leave. I'm not sure I follow," he muttered. "It's when one small shift triggers a chain," Dorian said quietly, "that topples an entire system." For a split second, the confidence slipped from Trevor's face. The passengers in the nearby rows could sense the change in temperature between them. What had started as a mocking exchange now held something sharper, heavier, like the stillness before a lightning strike. Trevor gave a nervous chuckle and stepped back. "Enjoy the rest of your flight," he said awkwardly before continuing down the aisle without another word. Dorian didn't move. He simply folded his hands in his lap and glanced at Mason, 2 rows behind. Mason, dressed in a crisp charcoal jacket and casual slacks, looked up from his tablet. With the flick of his finger, he tapped the screen twice, subtle but precise. The transfer had already been queued before they'd even boarded. Now it was live. Encrypted pathways opened silently across digital highways. The interface on Mason's screen pulsed a soft green as data swept through secure servers. The trades appeared modest: fractional purchases of airline subsidiary stock, tech contractor shares, AI algorithm licenses linked to onboard software systems. To any casual observer, they looked like portfolio diversifications. But Mason knew better. Dorian had orchestrated this sequence like a composer with a symphony, each note calculated, every trade timed with purpose. As the turbulence faded, the plane drifted into a calmer glide. Flight attendants resumed their routine, pushing carts, pouring drinks, pretending nothing had happened. But the mood in the back half of the aircraft had shifted. Dorian could feel it, like a low frequency others couldn't hear. Something had been set in motion. His mind drifted for a moment, not to revenge, but to mathematics. To the theory he had studied years ago in grad school. Systemic fragility didn't begin with collapse. It began with the assumption that no one was watching, that arrogance, unchecked, was just a ripple, but ripples build tides. Mason's screen flashed again. Trade signal acknowledged. A secondary alert triggered across a financial backend used by Vistral's tech infrastructure teams. Automated systems would log it as a high-frequency purchase, the kind that raised internal flags, but not fast enough. Dorian reached into the pocket of his jacket and pulled out a stylus, tapping a few notes into his own tablet. He wasn't writing strategy, he was observing momentum. The market would shift slowly at first, but the plane wasn't on the ground yet. 3 rows up, the white man who had taken Dorian's original seat in first class turned his head and glanced back. Their eyes met. The man looked away quickly, adjusting his collar. Trevor passed by again, avoiding Dorian's gaze entirely now. He looked distracted, even unsettled, his steps less confident, his smile no longer present. Dorian exhaled softly and leaned back, his gaze resting on the seat in front of him. The smallest arrogance, he thought, can cost an empire. "Sir, it says here you're first class." This must be a mistake. The words landed like a thunderclap in the otherwise hushed cabin. The male flight attendant, younger and less performative than Trevor, glanced back and forth between the screen on his handheld device and Dorian Kells, who stood beside him in the narrow aisle between economy and business class. His brows pinched with confusion as if the numbers on the manifest had suddenly betrayed the logic of his training. Trevor Mace's voice sliced through the tension like a dull blade. "That's already been reassigned," he said, striding up the aisle with forced authority. His tone was clipped, but beneath the surface was an unmistakable twitch of uncertainty. The younger attendant didn't flinch, but he straightened, blocking Trevor's path with a subtle shift of his shoulder. "His boarding pass is valid," he said quietly, tapping the screen again. "First class, 3A. There's no reassignment notice logged." Trevor's smirk faltered for a split second before returning, thinner this time, a mask fraying at the corners. It must have been a manual override. The seat was given to. Dorian lifted a hand slowly. "I believe," he said calmly, "the system is correcting itself." The surrounding passengers, those who had overheard bits of the interaction, leaned subtly into the moment, their collective attention threading together like an invisible web. Even the man in seat 3A, a pale businessman in his 50s who had boarded smugly, now peeked around his seat divider, brows raised in quiet concern. The younger attendant nodded. "I'll escort you to your seat, sir." He turned without waiting for Trevor's approval. Dorian followed, unhurried. Each step through the narrow aisle felt deliberate, as though he were not merely walking toward a seat, but toward a reckoning. Mason, 2 rows back, watched with muted satisfaction, his eyes flicking from his laptop screen, now flashing a silent, trade-executed confirmation, to the slowly unfolding tableau. Behind them, Trevor stood rigid, his mouth slightly open but bereft of words. A few passengers cast glances his way, eyes narrowed not with anger, but with that subtle disbelief reserved for those caught misusing their position. Dorian passed the curtain divider, his polished shoes stepping onto the subtly thicker carpet of first class. It was quieter here, more spacious, yet every detail felt magnified, every glance, every breath. The man currently occupying 3A looked up at him, unsure whether to defend or apologize. "You must be mistaken," the man stammered, half rising. "No," Dorian said with steady resolve. "They were." The young attendant offered an apologetic nod. "Sir," he said to the businessman, "we'll reassign your seat. There's been a correction in the manifest. We apologize for the inconvenience." The businessman didn't argue. Something in Dorian's presence, or perhaps the ripple of authority behind his calm, seemed to still any resistance. He gathered his briefcase and shuffled down the aisle without a word. As Dorian lowered himself into the reclaimed seat, he didn't adjust his watch or glance around in triumph. He simply exhaled, controlled, composed. The leather of the seat creaked faintly beneath him, the only sign that the moment had passed into history. From his position at the curtain, Trevor watched it all unfold, his posture locked in disbelief. This wasn't just a customer reclaiming a seat, it was something else, something larger, something out of his depth. The younger attendant stepped aside and gave a final respectful nod before retreating. The curtain drew shut between classes with a quiet sweep. Dorian leaned back slightly and pressed his fingertips together, elbows resting on the armrests. His gaze settled on the small window, where clouds drifted like soft islands against a sea of blue. But his mind was elsewhere, already calculating. The buy order had been executed flawlessly. 2.4% of Vistral Aviation Holdings, acquired in a silent wave under a shell consortium, Mason had activated mid-flight. The ripple would begin within minutes. Automated tracking systems, shareholder monitors, and back-end alert software would all begin flagging the anomaly. It wouldn't look like a hostile move, but it would feel like one to anyone paying close attention. The timing was intentional, the precision clinical. He reached slowly for the tablet that Mason had slipped into his briefcase before takeoff. As he unlocked it, fresh notifications populated the screen. Trade routing confirmed. Holdings report scheduled. Parent board pinged for irregular activity. A smile tugged at the corner of Dorian's lips, not of amusement, but of understanding. Everything was in motion. The humiliation he had endured in economy wasn't erased by this gesture, it was converted, transmuted into momentum. From the front galley, another male attendant offered a silent nod as he passed, setting a tray of refreshments on the fold-out table. Dorian nodded in return, his expression unreadable. Then came the whisper of the curtain again. Trevor, his posture looser now, less sure of its own authority, stepped forward. "I just came to clarify things," he began, voice lower, more cautious than before. "There may have been some miscommunication at the gate. We're still trying to—" "There's nothing to clarify," Dorian said without looking up. His tone was cool, precise. The system already resolved the discrepancy. Trevor hesitated. "Right. Yes. Still, I'd like to apologize." Dorian finally turned, his gaze steady and firm. "Mistakes," he said, his voice quiet but firm, "have a way of revealing systems." The words hung in the air like the final chime of a struck bell. Trevor blinked, lips parting slightly, but no words came. Behind him, the hum of the engines continued as if untouched by the sudden wait in the cabin. Passengers watched in silence. No one said a word. Dorian turned his eyes back toward the window, letting the sky consume his attention. The curtain closed once more, sealing the moment with quiet finality. And behind it, in a world of hidden exchanges and masked algorithms, a shift had begun, one far greater than any reassignment of seats. You can strip a man of his seat, Dorian thought, but never his leverage. The landing gear struck the tarmac with a jolt that rippled through the cabin. The seatbelt sign blinked on, but already heads turned as two uniformed security officers stepped briskly through the forward cabin doors before the plane had even fully taxied. Their presence was immediate, deliberate, and unmistakably authoritative. Dorian Kells didn't move. He sat composed in his reclaimed first-class seat, legs crossed, gaze steady, as if he'd known exactly what time the clock would chime. Across the aisle, passengers murmured, curious, confused, some sensing the shift without knowing its cause. Trevor Mace, still attempting to maintain the posture of a professional, turned with forced cheer toward the approaching officers. "Is there a disturbance we should be aware of?" he asked, smiling too broadly, his fingers brushing the edge of the galley counter in a nervous twitch. The lead officer, a tall man in his mid-40s with steel-gray temples and a badge bearing the insignia of Vistral Corporate Compliance, held up a small tablet. "Trevor Mace?" he asked plainly. Trevor blinked. "Yes, that's me. You're being temporarily detained for questioning under Section 4.7 of Internal Employee Conduct Policy. We've received a flag from headquarters indicating a procedural violation on this flight." Trevor's face paled like a sheet pulled tight. "Wait, what? What violation?" His voice cracked, trying to steady itself under the weight of confusion and dread. "I've followed all procedures. This must be a mix-up." The second officer, younger, silent until now, stepped forward and gently took hold of Trevor's arm, not forcibly, but firmly enough to make the message clear. This was not optional. In row 4B, Mason shifted his tablet screen just slightly, the soft glow illuminating a small display at the bottom. Audit activated. 78% file review complete. He leaned forward just enough for Dorian to see, whispering across the aisle. "The audit's live, sir." Dorian gave the faintest nod. His expression was unreadable, not smug, not cold, but razor-sharp. His cufflinks gleamed as he adjusted them. The moment had begun. As the plane finally rolled to a stop at Gate 7 of Caldon City's executive terminal, the seatbelt sign chimed off. Passengers rose in unison, but their usual rush was stalled by the unusual presence of authority. Trevor stood frozen in the aisle, glancing around as if searching for a lifeline. The very air seemed to press against him. His voice dropped, barely audible. "This can't be real." A voice came from behind, calm, controlled, lethally polite. "Mr. Mace," said the older compliance officer, now reviewing a file on his device, "you are also under preliminary review for racial bias and violation of passenger rights under Federal Aviation Ethics Guidelines. You'll be escorted for formal questioning." Trevor's mouth opened, but no words came out. Sweat gathered just below his collar. His composure broke in micro-expressions, quivering jaw, darting eyes, shallow breaths. He turned reflexively toward the first-class cabin where Dorian was now standing. Kells didn't speak yet. He stepped out slowly into the aisle, every movement measured. Passengers turned to watch, unsure if he was part of the security team or the reason for it. He stopped beside Trevor, not out of confrontation, but choice. For a moment, they stood there in the narrow corridor of the aircraft, a foot apart, but a world away. Dorian met Trevor's eyes, and in that silence, everything was exposed. The smugness from earlier, the casual dismissal, the belief that Dorian didn't belong where he sat. Then came the voice, cool, restrained, low enough that only Trevor and those closest could hear it. "Never underestimate who you move aside." Trevor flinched as if the words had weight. He watched helplessly as Dorian turned from him and walked forward into the open jet bridge. The moment Dorian emerged, a wave of cameras and flashbulbs greeted him. Reporters had gathered, tipped off by a leak from Caldon's financial press network. They weren't expecting a scandal, they were expecting an arrival, the newest executive shareholder of Vistral Aviation Holdings. "Mr. Kells, Mr. Kells, are you here for the summit or the audit announcement?" one reporter shouted. Another leaned over the rope line, mic extended. "Are you taking a seat on the board?" Dorian didn't respond. He simply stepped into the first of 3 waiting black sedans idling at the curb, Mason already inside. The door closed silently and the convoy pulled away, vanishing into the city with practiced elegance. Back on the jet bridge, Trevor remained under guard, now more ghost than man. Passengers passed him awkwardly, some curious, others indifferent, a few recording. In the quiet that followed, one of the compliance officers turned to Dorian before he left and said respectfully, "Mr. Kells, headquarters has requested your statement at your convenience." Dorian nodded once, the same calm flickering behind his eyes. No gloating, no rage, just clarity. Behind them, Trevor's knees almost buckled. "This can't be happening," he whispered again, but no one answered. Dorian adjusted his cufflinks one last time before disappearing into the terminal. "Justice isn't always loud," he murmured as he adjusted his cufflinks. "Sometimes it's traded." The headlines dropped like hail on glass. By 6:14 a.m., the financial networks were already scrambling. Anonymous buyout wave targets, Vistral Aviation Holdings, blared across news tickers and mobile alerts. The anchors looked more stunned than informed. Analysts spoke in circles, speculating about hedge funds, mergers, and regulatory signals. No one knew where the surge had come from. No firm had claimed it. No leak had warned of it. The trades were clean, precise, surgical. Dorian Kells stood barefoot in the corner of his hotel suite, floor-to-ceiling windows framing Caldon City in muted gold. The skyline blinked beneath the early morning sun like an engine awakening. In his hand, a single cup of black coffee steamed quietly. The silence was intentional. He hadn't turned on the television. He didn't need to. The ripple had already started. He wasn't here to chase the reaction. He had designed it. Behind him, the door to the suite clicked open. Mason stepped in, slightly out of breath, holding a tablet still loading market feeds. His tie was crooked, his sleeves rolled up. "Sir," he said, placing the device on the coffee table. "It's spreading faster than expected." Dorian didn't turn. He sipped slowly, eyes still on the window. "Good," he replied. "Let them scramble before they understand what hit them." On the screen, the Vistral logo dipped in and out of focus as new numbers rolled in. Shares of its regional logistics arm were surging. Its fuel subsidy partner was crashing. Two subsidiaries, Arevia Skylink and Holland Metrics, were seeing volatility spikes. Investors were confused, and board members were starting to panic. Exactly as planned. Mason leaned on the back of a chair. "Still no flags from the SEC," he said. "They think it's a competitive play." "It is," Dorian murmured. "Just not the one they expected." His phone buzzed. One vibration. Unknown number. The timing was too perfect to be random. He walked to the table and picked it up, answering without greeting. "Mr. Kells," came the voice, measured, formal, threaded with caution. "This is Reagan Solis, Interim Director, Vistral Aviation Board." Dorian's silence held. He didn't respond. Let the man sweat. "I believe we owe you an apology," Solis continued, clearing his throat. "Word reached me about an incident on Flight 327. The hesitation in his tone was deliberate. He wasn't sure what Dorian knew. Worse, he didn't know what Dorian had done. Still, Dorian said nothing. Solis pushed on. "We're currently investigating the staff involved, and we'd like to offer a formal meeting. Tomorrow, our team is available any time you are." Dorian walked slowly toward the glass window again, watching a tiny plane ascend in the distance, leaving a white streak behind it. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, firm, and unmistakably in control. "The meeting will not be in a hotel," he said. "It will be at your control center." There was a pause, barely a beat, but it hung in the air. "Of course," Solis said quickly, trying to recover. "Yes, we can make that happen. I'll send—" "I want to see how your system works," Dorian cut in. Then he ended the call. Mason looked up from his tablet, his brows drawn low. "You're not just settling this, are you?" Dorian turned his head slightly, the faintest glimmer of something steely in his eyes. "No," he said, almost whispering. "I'm restructuring it." At 9 a.m., sharp, Dorian Kells stepped into the gleaming lobby of Vistral Aviation's headquarters. He did not pause. His shoes clicked crisply against the marble floor, the sound slicing through the muted rustle of executives whispering as he passed. There was no receptionist greeting him. She had already seen the name flash on her terminal and alerted the 12th floor before he even reached the elevator. When the elevator doors opened, a security escort waited silently, giving him a respectful nod and gesturing toward the boardroom. No words. Just the quiet weight of a presence that no one had expected to have this kind of power, at least not this soon. The boardroom was large, lined with frosted glass and curved chrome edges. The panoramic window behind the long conference table revealed the company's private runway and rows of grounded jets shimmering under the morning sun. But no one in the room looked out at them. All eyes were on Dorian. Reagan Solis, acting chairman of the board, stood awkwardly at the head of the table. To his right was Marlon Vex, the compliance director, a man with steely gray eyes and a stiffness that came from too many years of risk management. Next to him sat Dean Raker, head of operations, thick-necked and clearly uncomfortable, shifting papers that didn't need sorting. They rose with polite smiles that barely masked the discomfort etched into their expressions. "Mr. Kells," Solis began, voice rehearsed but faltering at the edges, "first, let me extend an apology on behalf of the company for the treatment you endured aboard our flight. The attendant has been suspended pending investigation." Dorian didn't sit. He raised his hand gently, cutting through the air like a scalpel. "Suspension doesn't change systems," he said, his voice calm but carrying a cold resonance. "It only hides them." A beat of silence spread like a ripple. Solis's mouth opened, then closed. Vex folded his hands but didn't speak. The room grew tense, not with hostility, but anticipation. Dorian turned slowly and walked to the window, his reflection blurring into the skyline behind him. He clasped his hands behind his back. "Do you know what your staff did to me?" he asked, not facing them. "They downgraded me for a white passenger. No explanation, no apology, no protocol. Just a decision made in the moment." He paused. "But what they really did," he continued, "was show me how your system assigns value." His voice was even, but beneath it was the weight of a man who had not come here for a press release or a shallow gesture. The board members exchanged uneasy glances. Vex leaned forward, clearing his throat. "We assure you, Mr. Kells," he said, "this was not company policy. Our procedures are—" Dorian turned sharply, his eyes pinning Vex in place. "Then let's change policy." Permanently, the tension broke like glass under pressure. The board flinched, not visibly, but inwardly, the kind of subtle reaction that only comes from men who realize the situation had turned into something far larger than they were prepared for. At that exact moment, Mason entered the room. He moved with practiced calm, placing a thick file folder on the table. No one reached for it immediately. They didn't need to. The moment Mason set it down, a soft digital tone chimed from the screen embedded into the wall behind them. Data began to stream automatically, activated from a secure uplink keyed to Dorian's identity badge. Graphs, heat maps, names, timestamps, dots connecting to patterns. "This," Mason said, his voice steady, "is a compiled set of analytics from Vegan's Verity protocol. It overlays your seating assignment logs with internal employee decisions, color-coded by upgrade justification, flight crew routing, and boarding priority overrides." Solis leaned forward slowly, reading the captions beneath the graphs. Vex adjusted his glasses and scanned the headers. Raker scowled but said nothing. They were all seeing it for the first time. Lines of data they never imagined someone outside their firewall could extract. "You had access to this?" Solis asked, barely more than a whisper. Dorian didn't blink. "You gave it to me," he said, "when you scanned my boarding pass." The attendant forced him to leave his first-class seat without reason, calling it policy, while others watched in silence. If you believe arrogance disguised as authority must always be exposed, hit subscribe now. Because justice doesn't argue, it executes. What followed was not an argument, but a quiet corporate storm. The boardroom fell into a stillness that bordered on surreal. The soft hum of the central ventilation system seemed louder than any voice. Dorian Kells stood at the head of the long obsidian glass table, the city skyline stretching out behind him through floor-to-ceiling windows. A digital projection glowed above him, casting subtle blue light over the table, where a dozen executive faces sat locked in uneasy silence. The screen displayed a report title, Vistral Aviation, Internal Bias Diagnostics, Vigen AI Scan version 3.7. Dorian didn't pace, didn't raise his voice, and didn't flinch. He simply stood still, the remote in one hand, the room hanging on his every breath. "I'm going to show you a pattern," he said quietly. With a single click, the first chart appeared. A heat map, colored in violent reds and sharp yellows, displayed boarding priority decisions across 12 major Vistral flight routes. Race, age bracket, dress code, surname ethnicity, ticket type, and incident flagging were coded into the dataset. No names, just truth. Each chart revealed the same consistent tilt. Minority passengers with upgraded tickets were 4.6 times more likely to be reassigned or accidentally downgraded when flights approached full capacity. In 91% of these incidents, Dorian continued, the decision was marked as manual override. Not automated, human choice. He tapped again. Now came timeline overlays, showing that these overrides coincided disproportionately with high-level white passengers boarding late. Another chart followed, and another. The data wasn't just raw, it was damning. No one spoke. Not yet. "You've heard the term random assignment," Dorian said, "but the numbers say otherwise. Your own system is rigged." Regan Solis, the interim board director, shifted forward. His voice was slow, almost reluctant. "Mr. Kells, if these numbers are accurate—" "They are," Dorian said flatly. Solis hesitated, then nodded. "Then this is catastrophic." From the far end of the table, Marlon Vex, the compliance director, cleared his throat and tried to find footing. "What exactly are you proposing?" he asked, voice tight. Dorian folded his hands calmly. "A joint restructuring. Vigen Systems will take operational oversight of your passenger analytics division, data infrastructure, HR, flagging metrics, internal audit trails." A murmur. "In exchange," he continued, "your board retains 60% equity control, but only if you agree to immediate reform protocols." Marlon frowned. "You're suggesting we let your company run part of ours, because of one incident on a flight?" Dorian's gaze sharpened. He didn't blink. "I'm not suggesting anything." He stepped aside so the screen behind him could display the live market feed. The real-time chart showed Vistral Aviation stock in descent, down another 4% in the past hour. "I'm informing you of a decision your market has already made." The silence now wasn't stunned. It was frightened. Eyes flicked between Dorian and the falling red line behind him. Mason, seated discreetly in the corner, leaned forward and whispered just loud enough, "Press caught the rumor, sir." Dorian nodded slightly but kept his eyes on the table. "Gentlemen," he said finally, his voice still calm but with a blade of finality in its tone, "every trade carries risk. The question is whether you adapt or disappear." The murmurs broke out like a sudden tremor. Around the boardroom table, the once composed executives of Vistral Aviation Holdings were now visibly rattled. Regan Solis, the interim chairman, lifted his hand to call for silence, his voice catching slightly as he said, "Let's move into a closed session." But the door swung open before he could finish. An assistant in a gray blazer, breathless and clutching a tablet, stepped in without ceremony. "Sir," he announced urgently, "multiple shareholder blocks have initiated emergency votes." They're siding with Vigen. The room froze. Chairs scraped quietly as heads turned. Dean Raker blinked rapidly, unsure he had heard correctly. Marlon Vex, the compliance director, leaned forward sharply. "What blocks?" he asked. "All of them, sir," the assistant replied. "They're consolidating under Vigen's proposal." "We're being outmaneuvered in real time." Regan sat back, the blood visibly draining from his face. Outside the vast window wall, clouds drifted like distant smoke trails. Inside, a different kind of fire was catching, slow, calculated, unstoppable. Dorian Kells remained seated at the far end of the table. his demeanor unchanged. He didn't gloat. He didn't even smile. His fingers were steepled in front of him, elbows resting on the glossy surface as if the chaos belonged to someone else. "This is impossible," Marlin muttered, flipping through a digital report. "This shouldn't be happening." "Not this fast," Dorian's voice cut through the confusion. Calm. Precise. "Speed isn't chaos." Its design Solus turned to him with a stunned expression. "Mr. Kells, you orchestrated this in under 24 hours. "No," Dorian said quietly, standing at last. "I responded to something that was already broken." A new silence took over. Heavy. Awkward. Marlin, visibly trying to regain control of the room, shifted papers unnecessarily and cleared his throat. "There's one more issue to confirm," he said stiffly, "regarding the flight in question, Flight 327. All eyes turned to him. Marlin tapped a document on his screen. "The compliance report came through this morning. The flight attendant involved in the seat reassignment, Trevor Mace, has been terminated, effective immediately." A long beat passed. Dorian didn't blink. "You fired one man to protect your image," he said slowly, voice steady. "I moved one trade to reveal your reality." The sentence hung in the air like a stone dropped into still water. The executives stared at him, unsure whether they'd just witnessed a statement or a verdict. Reagan leaned back, almost defeated. His hand moved to loosen his tie slightly as he exhaled with a weary breath. "Mr. Kells," he began cautiously, "you've just bought yourself a seat on this board." Dorian's eyes didn't flinch. His response was as smooth as glass. "I didn't buy it," he said, stepping back from the table. "You gave it away when you let bias run your sky." No one dared to speak. The air was thick with unspoken truths, and every man in that room knew something irreversible had just occurred. Outside, behind the boardroom glass, the clouds continued their slow drift, indifferent to the empire being redrawn within. Far across the city, in a dimly lit office stacked with old paper files and outdated equipment, Trevor Mace sat hunched at a desk, staring at an email he hadn't expected. The subject line was brief: termination notice, conduct violation. He read it twice, then a third time. His hand moved slowly to the mouse, but he didn't click away. He simply sat there, stunned. One small moment of arrogance had cost a company millions, and cost him everything. Back inside Vistral's headquarters, Dorian walked to the elevator, Mason falling into step behind him. No one stopped them. No one dared. As the elevator doors closed, sealing away the stunned silence behind them, Dorian adjusted the sleeve of his jacket. Sometimes, he thought as the numbers descended quietly, revenge isn't fire. It's math. His silence had become the loudest statement in the entire industry. "They agreed," Mason said quietly, stepping into the office with a thick folder in hand. His voice was calm, but there was a tremor beneath it, like a man who knew the weight of what he was carrying. He closed the glass door behind him and crossed the wide floor of Vigan Systems' new joint headquarters, the sun gleaming off the steel beams overhead. Outside, the skyline of Calden City blinked with the rhythms of commerce, but in this room, something far more important than profit was being finalized. Dorian Kells didn't look up from his screen at first. He sat at a desk of polished black walnut, fingers interlaced, gaze focused on the graphs that danced across his curved monitor. Stock lines, complaint logs, employee audit reports. Everything was changing, and he was the one changing it. After a pause, he exhaled softly. "Full operational oversight?" he asked without turning his head. Mason placed the file on the desk and nodded. "Analytics, HR protocols, bias audits. All ours," he confirmed. Dorian nodded slowly, once. His face was unreadable, carved from thought. There was no smile, no rush of triumph, only a quiet certainty that the system was bending in the direction it should have pointed from the beginning. "Good," he said. "Now we rebuild, not revenge." He reached forward and tapped his screen. A new project file opened, labeled the Verity Index. Lines of code streamed by as his prototype team's architecture began to take shape. The Verity Index would operate silently within the core of Vistral's passenger systems, monitoring every action, from gate assignments to in-flight service decisions. It would detect patterns of behavior that betrayed unconscious bias. It wouldn't accuse. It wouldn't punish. It would observe, record, and alert, a mirror too honest to be ignored. An internal watchdog? Mason asked, watching the digital schematics come to life. A conscience, Dorian replied, one they can't switch off. He stood up and walked toward the tall windows, his reflection merging with the skyline. Below, cars flowed through the city streets like veins carrying momentum. Vigen Systems had always been a vessel of disruption, but this was different. It was personal. Mason crossed his arms. Won't that make enemies? Dorian turned to him with a faint smile. Reform always does. There was no need to speak further. The silence between them said everything. A silence born not from hesitation, but from understanding. They had started this journey with a stolen seat. Now they were redefining how that seat was assigned, who received it, and why. Later that evening, Dorian left the building alone. The lobby was quiet, emptied of the usual buzz. The security guard at the desk gave him a respectful nod, and he returned it with a glance that held quiet acknowledgement. As he stepped through the revolving doors, the streetlight painted silver lines across the sidewalk. His car waited by the curb, a sleek, silent electric sedan with tinted windows and a driver who didn't speak unless spoken to. But before Dorian could reach the door, a voice called out from across the pavement. Mr. Kells. The voice was young, male, breathless, belonging to a journalist who had clearly been waiting for hours. He held up a recording device and stumbled forward, tie crooked, camera bag bouncing against his hip. Just one question, sir, the reporter panted. What made you act so calmly that day? Dorian turned slowly. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes sharpened like glass catching the last rays of dusk. For a moment, he didn't respond. The traffic passed in background rhythm. The world paused, if only for a breath. Then he spoke, clear, steady, and without hesitation. Because storms look smaller from above the clouds, he said before stepping into his car. Dean Raker slammed the door of his office shut just hard enough to signal frustration without raising suspicion. His hands trembled slightly as he shuffled through the latest merger oversight reports, the digital display on his tablet flickering with rising numbers that should have thrilled him. But instead, they unsettled him. Vigen Systems had not only delivered on its promises, it had done so with surgical precision. Efficiency was up. Passenger satisfaction up. Complaint resolution time down. But beneath the numbers, Raker saw something else. Control slipping away. He tapped a secure line. Harvey, he said into the phone, his voice tight, we need to revisit the merger terms. Vigen's operational control is growing faster than projected. We need leverage. On the other side of the call, Harvey Dale, a conservative board member with years of backroom influence, responded cautiously. You think we can reverse the terms? We don't reverse them, Raker replied. We reframe them. We pressure compliance, slow down integration, raise red flags, anything that creates friction, give them a reason to compromise. But what Raker didn't realize was that one of Vigen's embedded oversight engineers had already flagged the call, and hours later, Mason would deliver a short message to Dorian's private office in the newly renovated analytics wing. Raker's moving. Dorian didn't raise an eyebrow. He simply stood, crossed the room, and reached into a drawer. From it, he pulled a slim data stick with a single folder titled Legacy Patterns, DR. He slid it across the desk toward Mason. Release it quietly, he said, his voice low and steady. No headlines. Just truth. The report was elegant in its simplicity. a decade-long breakdown of ticket reassignment trends across Raker's previous tenure in logistics. The data showed that over 87% of last-minute upgrades, reroutes, or priority bumps were assigned to passengers flagged as preferred, yet no internal audit had ever verified the criteria for those preferences. The patterns were damning. Most of those preferred passengers shared a demographic consistency that was no longer tolerable in Heirloom's new age of accountability. By mid-week, internal discussions had turned cold around Raker. A compliance officer knocked on his glass door the next morning with a formal envelope. He read it once and then again. Voluntary resignation, it said, effective immediately. No explanation was offered, and none was required. That evening, Mason found Dorian seated in a quiet corner of the analytics floor, a rare moment of pause in an otherwise kinetic life. The office was dim, the only light coming from the large monitor where a paused video feed showed the narrow aisle of Flight 327. Dorian watched the footage in silence, himself standing from first class, adjusting his blazer, stepping toward the rear. On the screen, Trevor Mace's smirk froze mid-frame. It was the moment that started it all. "You're still watching that?" Mason asked, stepping closer. Dorian didn't turn. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "you have to remember what it cost. Not just the victory, but the reason it was necessary." Mason hesitated. "Raker's gone. The board won't challenge you again. Vigen's earnings jumped 30% this quarter. You built something lasting." Dorian finally turned, his face unreadable. "That look," he said, nodding toward Trevor's frozen image, "built an empire. But I wish it hadn't been necessary." The applause had just died down when Dorian Kells stepped up to the microphone, the lights of the conference hall dimming slightly to focus on the solitary figure at the center of the stage. His posture was firm but not rigid, hands resting lightly on the sides of the podium. Rows upon rows of employees, suited in Heirloom's new silver and blue lanyards, sat in anticipation. Some whispered, some leaned forward, but all waited to hear from the man whose quiet defiance had reshaped the very walls around them. "You all know how this started," Dorian began, his voice even, resonating without need for volume. No preamble, no self-congratulation, just a line spoken with the clarity of memory. One man's seat was taken because someone decided he didn't belong there. A few heads tilted. Some knew the story. Others had only heard fragments. Rumors passed between breakroom chatter and onboarding briefings. But in this room, Dorian's presence confirmed the legend. And he wasn't here to be a symbol. He was here to be a mirror. He scanned the audience, eyes meeting faces, some wide-eyed, some uneasy, some blank with corporate composure. Then his gaze settled briefly on the front row, where a group of mid-level managers sat stiffly, one of them shifting his tie uncomfortably. Dorian knew the look. He'd seen it often. It was the look of men who wondered if they'd ever made someone feel invisible without realizing it. "The truth is, every time a system accepts that silence," Dorian continued, his voice slightly softer now, "it becomes guilty too." The air in the room seemed to still. There was no movement, no rustling, just the low hum of stage lights above and the quiet breath of 1,000 men listening, not because they had to, but because they suddenly wanted to. "I didn't destroy your company," he said next, his eyes unwavering. "I only revealed what it already was. The rest, you built yourselves." A flicker of something unreadable passed across his face. Not pride, not anger, but something deeper. Responsibility. He stepped back from the microphone, offering no dramatic pause, no grand exit. He simply nodded once and turned, walking off stage into the dim corridor that led backstage. Mason was already there, standing by a tall utility case near the curtain rigging. His arms were crossed, but his brow was furrowed, thoughtful. "You didn't mention Trevor's name once," he said quietly, falling into step beside Dorian. Dorian slowed for a moment, glancing sideways. "Names don't fix systems," he replied, voice low. "Structures do." They walked in silence for a few steps, their shoes echoing faintly against the polished backstage tiles. A technician carrying cables nodded at them as he passed, unsure if he should say something more. He didn't. Outside, dusk had begun to settle over the city, casting warm orange hues across the skyline. The air was cooler now, and the buildings gleamed like glass spires in the last light. Dorian's driver waited by the back entrance, but he waved him off with a subtle motion. "Just give me a few minutes," he murmured. Mason stood back as Dorian stepped to the edge of the lot, the tall metal fence separating them from the buzz of the main road. Beyond it, the city stretched out, alive with traffic, lights, and movement, but distant enough to feel quiet. He pulled his coat closer and looked up. The skyline reflected faintly in the windows above him, twin towers glowing in silver, their glass panes catching the last shimmer of twilight. And as Dorian stood there, thoughts pulled inwards, another memory returned, not one of boardrooms or planes or deals, but of a small garage cluttered with tools and motor parts. His father's voice came to him, clear as if it had never left. "They said I wasn't fit to fly, son. But I built engines for the men who did. That's how I kept going." At 12, Dorian hadn't fully understood what that meant. At 37, it had become his map. He blinked slowly, watching as the city shifted from dusk to night, 100 new lights flickering on in windows and streets. Mason remained respectfully behind him, silent, sensing the gravity of the moment. "Every humiliation," Dorian whispered more to himself than anyone else, "is just instruction for the next generation." Dorian Kells tapped the signature field without hesitation. The boardroom was quiet, too quiet for a transaction that would echo through aviation history. His finger lifted from the tablet screen, and the moment the digital confirmation blinked across Mason's tablet, it was done. 60% of Dorian's stake in Heirloom Global, formerly Vistral Aviation Holdings, was now sold back to the company. He had orchestrated the buy, the reform, the rebuild, and now the release. Reporters clustered in the hallway outside Vigen's downtown office tower. Their voices, muffled by thick glass, rose and fell in waves. One leaned over a camera tripod to catch a better view through the frosted doors. Inside, Dorian remained composed, eyes still on the screen, as Mason quietly slid the tablet into its case. "You just signed away control," Mason said, voice low but edged with disbelief. "Why now?" Dorian didn't answer immediately. He turned and stepped toward the window, looking out over the skyline, gray clouds forming a slow-moving ceiling above the city. His reflection hovered beside him, ghost-like on the glass. "Because the system doesn't need a ruler," he said finally. "It needs memory." He didn't say it with regret. He said it like an engineer sealing the final bolt on a completed framework, measured, exact, resolved. Downstairs, the first media bulletin had already hit the newswire. Kells exits with grace. Heirloom now fully independent. The rebranding of the airline had already taken effect weeks earlier. Heirloom Global was being celebrated as the first aviation company in the world to embed real-time bias detection into every operational layer. Every agent, every seating algorithm, every internal report was now passed through Vigen's patented Verity Index, a system designed not just to detect discrimination, but to remember it. It was memory turned into infrastructure. Memory with teeth. As the press release echoed across financial circuits, a quiet click sounded in a far smaller room across the city. Trevor Mace, now working as a logistics clerk for a third-tier charter outfit, leaned back in his creaky desk chair. The room around him was dim, lit only by a flickering desk lamp and the pale glow of a news anchor on the wall-mounted TV. He wasn't watching, at least, not at first. He was flipping through inventory sheets when he heard the anchor say, "And in a surprise decision, Heirloom's reform architect Dorian Kells has stepped down, citing the importance of systemic memory over individual power. Trevor glanced up. There he was. Dorian Kells stood behind a podium, mid-speech, captured live on the screen. The image froze briefly as the stream buffered, his face caught in a moment of calm intensity. Trevor stared. In that split second, he didn't see the CEO or the strategist. He saw the man he'd told to sit in the back. He saw the same navy suit, the same sharp gaze. But now it was framed in praise, not condescension. The screen flickered again. Dorian's voice came through. "We embedded accountability, not as a policy, but as architecture. Our goal was not just to change a company. It was to remind the sky who it belongs to." Trevor lowered the volume and sighed. There was no bitterness in him anymore, only weight, consequence. He stood slowly, as if age had crept into him too fast. On the corner of his desk sat a small photo frame. Him in his old uniform, hand on a galley cart, smiling. He turned it face down. Meanwhile, on the 49th floor of Vigan's tower, Mason approached Dorian for what he knew might be the final time as chief strategist. "You really think it'll last?" Mason asked, watching the city below. Dorian didn't answer at first. He reached for his blazer, his movements precise, then adjusted his collar as if preparing for some quiet ceremony. The boardroom behind him was now empty. The war had ended, and the architect had dismissed himself from the battlefield. "I think it has to," he said quietly. "Even if someone forgets, the code won't." Mason looked down at his tablet one last time. The Verity Index was running in the background, silently scanning policy updates, feedback logs, and performance reviews from across the fleet. It would never stop. "I'll walk out with you," he offered. Dorian shook his head. "Not yet," he said, his tone final but kind. "I want to watch one more flight." And he did. He turned to the wide window again, and just above the horizon, a jet silently cut through the clouds, its silver body gleaming in the fading light. No one on board would know the seat they sat in, whether front or back, had been paid for by a man who refused to let silence become the standard. Below, news channels continued to loop his interview. People across the country watched. Some applauded, others debated. But the story had already taken root. In the end, Dorian Kells didn't need to raise his voice. He had raised a standard. He turned from the window at last, his expression soft, not in pride, but in something quieter. Peace. And as he walked toward the elevator, his words lingered in the air, spoken not for applause, but for the architecture of memory itself. "All I did," he said softly, "was take back my seat." They forced him down a row, and moments later, he sent a trade that cost the airline its peace. If you believe real power doesn't shout, it acts, subscribe now. Because justice always flies higher. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It highlights racism, arrogance, and the poetic justice that follows when power meets accountability. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and encourage reflection on equality, respect, and the consequences of judging others by appearance instead of merit.